Power is most dangerous when it convinces a man that dignity is something he can vote away. On Monday morning, the mahogany table in the Mercer Dominion boardroom held a faint coldness beneath every polished reflection, as if the wood itself had learned to preserve secrets better than the people seated around it. The city glittered beyond the glass walls in pale winter light, all towers, steel, and quiet ambition, while the smell of expensive coffee drifted through the room in porcelain cups no one touched. Shareholders sat in tailored silence, their eyes moving from the sealed board packets to Julian Mercer, the billionaire whose name appeared on every report but not on every right. He liked rooms that waited for him. Julian entered at exactly 9, not early enough to appear eager and not late enough to seem careless, wearing a charcoal suit cut so precisely it seemed less like clothing than a declaration. Behind him walked his legal counsel, 2 senior executives, and a blonde woman named Sloane Avery, whose smile carried the polished confidence of someone who had been promised access before she had earned respect. At the head of the table, Julian placed his silver fountain pen beside the resolution packet, and the soft scratch of its nibs signing the attendance sheet sounded louder than any greeting. Then the room became still. Amara Voss arrived without hurry, dressed in a restrained burgundy suit that made no attempt to compete with the glass, marble, or wealth around her. She carried a simple black legal folder against one arm, her posture graceful, her expression calm, and her eyes so composed that several directors looked away before she had even taken her seat. Julian watched her cross the room as though she were walking toward a verdict he had already purchased. The room had not told him yet. Her chair remained at the long side of the table, 2 seats from the head, the same chair she had occupied for 6 years while Julian accepted applause for decisions she had quietly corrected before they became disasters. Today, a new placard had been placed beside Julian's right hand. Sloane Avery, Strategic Advisory Candidate. The title was not official yet, but the insult was. Amara noticed it once. Julian smiled with the soft cruelty of a man who believed public restraint was the same as surrender. He welcomed the board, thanked the shareholders, mentioned expansion, restructuring, and governance discipline, then slid one document forward as if he were moving a chess piece he had practiced in private. The shareholders said nothing. The resolution was printed on heavy cream paper, its language clean and bloodless, stating that Amara Voss would be removed from the board due to a divergence from the company's strategic direction. Julian did not look at her when counsel began reading it aloud. He watched the others instead, measuring obedience in lowered eyes and motionless hands. The coffee cooled. Amara rested her fingertips on the black folder and listened as the room tried to erase her with perfect grammar. She did not interrupt, did not tremble, did not ask for mercy, because the room had mistaken silence for weakness before it understood the contract. Julian finally turned to her, expecting injury. She gave him silence. Then, in a voice calm enough to make the legal counsel pause, Amara asked, "Has the shareholder register been updated this morning?" The question landed softly, but it changed the temperature of the room more than any accusation could have. Julian's legal counsel stopped with one hand on the resolution packet, his mouth still shaped around the next polished sentence, while 2 directors glanced toward the corporate secretary as if she might rescue them from a detail no one had prepared to discuss. Sloane Avery shifted in the chair beside Julian, crossing one elegant leg over the other, her diamond bracelet catching the morning light with the nervous brightness of something expensive but unsecured. Julian smiled anyway. "The register is not relevant to this motion," he said, his voice smooth enough for investors and sharp enough for the woman he expected to absorb it. Amara looked at the folder in front of her, not at him. "It is." No one moved. Julian leaned back, letting the silence stretch just long enough to remind the room who usually controlled its rhythm, then gestured toward Sloane with the relaxed arrogance of a man introducing his own future. "Before we proceed, the board should understand that Ms. Avery has been advising me personally on our luxury hospitality acquisition strategy, and after today's restructuring, I intend to recommend her for a formal advisory position." The word restructuring sat in the air like a clean knife. Sloane accepted the attention with a small smile, the kind designed to look modest while demanding to be noticed, and she placed one manicured hand near the empty leather portfolio that had been arranged for her. Her chair sat too close to the head of the table. No one needed to say why. Amara noticed the slight turn of the chief financial officer's face, the way he pretended to study a document while his eyes flicked toward the nameplate that did not yet belong there. She noticed the older shareholder in navy wool lowering his coffee cup without drinking from it. She noticed Julian's pen resting across the resolution like a weapon waiting to be picked up. She noticed everything. Julian continued, speaking of modernization, alignment, brand optics, and the need for board members who understood the new direction of Mercer Dominion. He never used the word wife. He never used the word betrayal. He did not need to. The insult had been wrapped in corporate language so neatly that pretending not to see it became part of the room's etiquette. Sloane turned toward Amara with a pleasant, practiced expression. "I hope this doesn't feel personal," she said. Amara met her eyes for 1 second. "It is legal." The room tightened. Sloane's smile thinned, not because she understood the sentence, but because she understood that it had not been offered for her comfort. Julian tapped the table once with 2 fingers, a small correction disguised as impatience, and his counsel resumed reading the resolution. The mahogany remained cold beneath Amara's hand. The expensive coffee continued to lose its heat. The shareholders remained silent, but their silence was no longer obedient. It had become watchful. Julian heard none of that. He was too busy enjoying the performance of control. He described Amara's removal as a difficult but necessary governance decision, praised her past charitable contributions, and suggested that her influence would be more appropriate outside the boardroom. It was the language powerful men used when they wanted to make exile sound like respect. Amara did not blink. When counsel finished reading, Julian lifted his fountain pen and looked down the table. "Unless there are objections, we will proceed to the vote." Amara opened the black folder at last, removed a single page, and placed it squarely before her. She did not slide it toward him. She did not raise her voice. She simply said, "There is an objection." Julian's pen stopped above the signature line, suspended there with the quiet disbelief of a man interrupted by someone he had already dismissed. His counsel turned toward Amara with professional irritation, the kind men learned in expensive law schools when they believed procedure belonged to them. Across the table, the corporate secretary looked at the single page Amara had placed before her and slowly removed her glasses. The room held its breath. "On what basis?" Julian asked, almost smiling, as if inviting her to embarrass herself in front of the people he still thought were his witnesses. Amara rested one hand beside the document. "Standing." The word was small. It cut cleanly. Counsel cleared his throat and said that Mrs. Voss's standing as a board member was precisely the matter under review, and that until the vote concluded, the board retained authority to proceed under the existing agenda. He spoke carefully, but his eyes had already shifted toward the corporate secretary, searching for confirmation that the ground beneath him was still solid. She did not give it. Julian's smile tightened. He asked for the page to be passed forward, but Amara did not move it, because the document did not need to travel to become dangerous. Existence was already notice. The older shareholder in navy wool leaned forward for the first time, his cuff links catching a narrow line of light from the window. Sloane looked from Julian to the board packet, then back to Amara, suddenly aware that there were forms of power no bracelet, promise, or private dinner could translate for her. The chief financial officer closed his folder halfway, not fully, as if he feared the sound might declare a side too early. No one wanted to be first. Julian exhaled through his nose and leaned toward Amara with a softened tone meant to sound reasonable. He said the board respected her history with the company, that no one wanted unnecessary friction, and that the proposed transition could be handled with dignity if she allowed the process to move forward. It was a generous speech only if one ignored the blade inside it. Amara looked at him. The process changed. Counsel's fingers tightened around the resolution. He asked whether she was claiming a procedural defect, an improper notice, or a voting irregularity, offering categories as if naming the cage would put her inside it. Amara turned the single page so the corporate secretary could read the header from across the table. It was not the resolution. It was an updated certification request stamped by the transfer agent that morning, attached to a reference number from the shareholder register. The secretary's face lost its color by one shade. Julian saw it. For the first time, he looked less annoyed than alert. He asked the secretary to explain what she was seeing, but she did not answer immediately because truth in a boardroom often arrived slower than fear. The silence of the shareholders changed again, gathering weight, turning from discomfort into calculation. Sloane uncrossed her legs. Julian's counsel set down the resolution packet and reached for his phone, then remembered phones were not allowed during executive voting sessions without board permission. He left his hand empty. Amara did not watch him struggle. She kept her eyes on the table, composed enough to make Julian's carefully arranged morning begin to pull at the seams. "This is a distraction," he said, but his voice had lost a fraction of its polish. Amara answered without lifting her chin. "It is ownership." The word moved through the room more heavily than anger could have. The corporate secretary finally stood, holding the page as if it had become too important to remain flat on the table, and said the updated register would have to be verified before any vote concerning board removal could proceed. Julian stared at her as if the rule had become offensive only after it reached him. His empire had always obeyed his timing. Not today. Counsel objected that the meeting agenda had been properly circulated and that late-filed documents should not alter the board's authority without independent review. The older shareholder in Navy will quietly asked whether the transfer agent's stamp was valid. The secretary said it appeared to be. Julian turned back to Amara, no longer pretending that Sloane mattered in this moment. "What did you do?" he asked. Amara closed the folder with one soft motion. "Read the register." The corporate secretary stepped toward the side console where the sealed compliance files had been placed before the meeting, and the sound of her heels against the marble floor seemed louder than Julian's entire opening speech. She unlocked the metal document case with a small brass key, removed a blue-bound register packet, and returned to the table without looking at Sloane, whose confidence had begun to sit poorly in the chair that had been arranged for her. Julian watched the packet as if it had personally betrayed him. Then the boardroom door opened. Mr. Graham Ellery entered with no apology and no hurry, wearing a dark suit cut in the old institutional style. His silver hair was neatly combed, his leather briefcase was worn at the corners, and his expression carried the calm authority of a man who trusted records more than reputations. He did not greet Julian first. He looked at the secretary. "Has the register been certified?" The question made Julian's jaw harden. Mr. Ellery placed his briefcase beside the chairman's seat, removed his glasses, and unfolded them with deliberate care while the room adjusted itself around him. Even the directors who had spent years flattering Julian straightened slightly, because Ellery was not there to be impressed. He was there to count votes. Julian gave a short laugh and said the board was in the middle of a duly noticed governance action, and that he would appreciate not turning a straightforward restructuring into theater. Ellery glanced at the resolution packet, then at the single page in front of Amara. "Ownership is not theater." The words were quiet. They ended something. Amara remained still, her fingers resting lightly on the closed black folder, her face composed in a way that made Julian's irritation look increasingly childish. Sloane lowered her gaze to the empty portfolio before her, perhaps realizing too late that expensive leather could not create authority where none had been granted. Counsel attempted to regain the room, explaining that the proposed removal concerned board fitness, not equity structure, and that voting rights should be assessed under the register available at the time notice was issued. Ellery put on his glasses. He did not blink. The secretary opened the blue-bound packet and began comparing the certified morning update with the board's prior voting schedule. Page after page turned with a dry, careful sound. Each page narrowed the room around Julian without anyone moving. The older shareholder in Navy will leaned back now, not relaxed, but prepared. Julian looked down the table, searching for the familiar signs of obedience. A nod from the CFO, a reassuring glance from counsel, a sympathetic smile from one of the legacy directors. He found only papers. Amara had not accused him, had not defended herself, had not raised her voice. And somehow every person in the room had begun moving around the fact of her instead of the volume of him. That was where the room first left him. Ellery asked the secretary to read the controlling entries aloud. She hesitated, then stated that several minority blocks had been consolidated under voting agreements executed over the previous quarter, that a preferred share conversion had been triggered before market open, and that an updated proxy authorization had been filed with the transfer agent at 8:17 that morning. Julian's eyes narrowed. By whom? The secretary looked at Amara. No one else needed to. Amara opened the folder again and slid forward one certified ownership certificate, its embossed seal catching the pale light from the windows. She did not smile. "Buy me." Sloane's bracelet made a small sound against the table as her hand moved back into her lap. Counsel reached for the document, but Ellery lifted one finger, stopping him before his hand crossed the line between procedure and panic. "Not yet," Ellery said. "We verify before we touch." Julian pushed back from the table slightly, not enough to stand, but enough for the chair to scrape against the floor. The noise was ugly in the polished room. He said the transactions were impossible, that no one could consolidate that much voting power without his knowledge, that the company would have flagged it, that someone would have told him. Amara looked at him at last. They did. The silence after that was different from all the others. It was not confusion now. It was recognition. Julian stared at her, and for the first time that morning, the billionaire who had entered as if the room belonged to him looked like a man trying to remember which warnings he had ignored because they came from his wife. Julian's chair settled back into place, but the sound had already exposed more fear than he intended. The ownership certificate remained in front of Amara, modest in size, decisive in consequence, its embossed seal reflecting a narrow strip of morning light across the mahogany table. Mr. Ellery asked the secretary to continue, and the room obeyed him with the strange relief people feel when procedure arrives to replace personality. The record began to do what no one in the room wanted to do aloud. The first block had come from retired partners Julian had stopped calling after their names disappeared from glossy annual reports. The second came through a preferred conversion clause buried inside a restructuring agreement he had celebrated 2 years earlier because it let him announce expansion without admitting dilution. The third came through proxy votes from regional investors whose lawsuits Amara had quietly settled before they could stain the company's credit line. Each fact was clean. None needed emphasis. Julian looked at his counsel, but counsel's face had changed from loyalty to liability assessment. The man did not defend the empire now. He measured exposure, dates, signatures, and whether his own advice had been ignored in writing. Sloane sat very still, her posture finally losing the relaxed entitlement she had worn into the room. She had been promised proximity to power. No one had explained the documents beneath it. Julian said the clauses could not have been activated without executive notice, and the secretary, after checking the packet, confirmed that notice had been issued to his office 3 times. Once by certified courier, once by legal email, once through board compliance. Amara did not look satisfied. She looked accurate. "I never saw it," Julian said, sharper than before, as though ignorance might become innocence if spoken with enough force. Ellery adjusted his glasses. "Your office acknowledged receipt." Julian turned on his assistant at the far end of the room, but the young man only lowered his eyes toward the table, pale and trapped between memory and payroll. A director who had spent a decade praising Julian's instincts suddenly became fascinated by the margins of his own packet. The expensive coffee had gone untouched long enough for a thin skin to form on one cup near the center of the table. No one reached for it. Ellery asked whether the proxy authorizations carried voting rights for matters of board composition and executive suspension. The secretary answered yes. Counsel tried to object that the intent of the proxies may have been limited to financing approvals, but Ellery asked him to cite the limiting language. Counsel opened his mouth. Nothing useful came out. Amara slid one additional page forward, not toward Julian, but toward the secretary. Section 7. The secretary found it quickly. Her voice was careful as she read that the proxy holder retained full voting discretion on governance matters, including director appointments, removals, committee authority, and emergency executive review. Julian's face hardened with the anger of a man discovering that his own signature had learned to testify against him. He stared at Amara as though she had stolen something. But the document said otherwise. The room understood the difference. The older shareholder in Navy Wolf finally spoke, not loudly, but with the weight of someone who had once trusted Julian and regretted it in private. He said the board should recognize the updated voting control before proceeding further. A bank representative nodded once. The CFO did not object. The silence was no longer neutral. It had taken a side. Julian felt it and looked toward Sloane, perhaps expecting admiration to restore him. She gave him uncertainty instead. That wounded him more than opposition. He leaned forward, lowering his voice, trying to make the conversation intimate inside a public defeat. Amara, this is my company. She looked at the certificate, then back at him. It was. The sentence did not rise. It landed. Mr. Ellery closed the register packet and placed both hands on top of it, as if sealing an era beneath his palms. He announced that, pending final verification already underway, Amara Voss held controlling voting authority sufficient to effect the scheduled motion. Julian did not speak for several seconds. Outside the glass, the city continued shining, indifferent to the private collapse unfolding above it. Inside, the empire Julian had mistaken for devotion began to rearrange itself around the woman he had underestimated. Mr. Ellery did not ask Julian's permission before changing the order of business, and that alone told the room more than any announcement could have. He requested that the pending removal motion be paused until the certified voting control was entered into the meeting record, and the corporate secretary began typing with a precision that sounded almost merciless in the stillness. Julian watched her fingers move, each keystroke turning his private plan into public evidence. The room had stopped revolving around him. Counsel whispered near Julian's shoulder, but the whisper carried no strategy, only caution, the kind a lawyer uses when a powerful client has become legally dangerous to himself. Sloane stared at the table as if she could make her name placard disappear by refusing to look at it. The CFO slid the original resolution packet farther from the center, a small movement, but not small enough to miss. Nothing small stayed small now. Julian stood. For years, standing had worked for him. Height, money, and timing had bent rooms before he ever had to argue. But today, the leather chair rolling back only made him look like a man trying to recover a stage that had already been dismantled. No one followed him. He said the board was being manipulated by technicalities, that a marriage dispute was being dressed up as governance, that no responsible director should allow personal resentment to interfere with a multi-billion-dollar expansion. The words were polished. The pause before them was not. Amara looked at him from her seat, her posture unchanged, her face calm enough to make his performance seem louder than it was. She did not defend her marriage. She did not explain her hurt. She did not give Sloane the dignity of a glance. She let the documents carry the weight. Mr. Ellery asked for the vote on whether to recognize the updated control position for purposes of the current meeting. Julian's eyes moved down the table, hunting. The older shareholder in Navy will voted first. Recognize. A bank representative followed. Then the CFO. Then two directors Julian had entertained for years in private clubs where access was mistaken for loyalty. One by one, the room moved away from him. Julian remained standing, his hands flat on the cold mahogany, as if touching the table could remind it who had paid for it. The secretary recorded the votes without expression. Sloane's bracelet clicked once more against the table, a fragile sound in a room that had no use left for decoration. When the count was finished, Ellery looked up. The updated voting control is recognized. Julian gave a short, disbelieving laugh, but no one joined him. The absence answered for them. Counsel advised that the original removal motion could not pass under the revised control structure unless Amara chose to support it, and the absurdity of that sentence finally landed across the table. Julian had drafted the motion and delivered her the leverage. Amara lowered her eyes to the document. Withdraw it. 2 words. The secretary looked to Ellery. Ellery looked to the board. No one objected. The resolution meant to remove Amara Voss was withdrawn from consideration, not with drama, not with apology, but with a procedural note typed into the minutes at 9:42 a.m. Julian stared at the screen where the meeting record updated in real time, and for the first time that morning his face showed not anger, but calculation failing. He turned toward Amara, lowering his voice as if he could still pull her back into the smaller world where he had once made her wait outside decisions. You are humiliating this company. Amara finally looked at him. You did. The sentence crossed the room and left nothing behind for him to use. Mr. Ellery then introduced an emergency governance motion to review executive authority, related party conduct, and unauthorized advisory commitments made in anticipation of Sloane Avery's appointment. Sloane's head lifted sharply. Julian's expression changed before he could hide it. The room understood exactly what those words meant. The vote had not merely saved Amara's seat. It had placed Julian's under review. The emergency motion entered the room without raised voices, and that made it more devastating than accusation. Mr. Ellery read the language slowly, each clause stripped of emotion, each phrase built from the kind of governance terms Julian had once used to intimidate weaker men. Review of executive authority, suspension of discretionary appointments, audit of related party commitments, temporary restriction of unilateral signing powers. It was removal written in corporate grammar. Julian remained standing, but the posture no longer looked commanding. It looked like refusal. Counsel touched his sleeve, a private warning not to speak before the record was complete, but Julian pulled his arm away as if caution were another betrayal. Sloane looked at the placard in front of her, then at the secretary, then at the sealed board packet that contained promises Julian had made before he had the right to make them. Her privilege was being reduced to a line item. Amara sat with her hands folded beside the black folder, neither pleased nor cruel, because the point was not revenge as spectacle. The record was correcting itself. Ellery asked whether there were any conflicts requiring disclosure before the motion proceeded. The question was formal, but every eye moved toward Sloane's chair. Julian saw it and turned cold. He said Ms. Avery's proposed role had no bearing on executive review, that her advisory participation was preliminary, that the board was allowing personal bias to contaminate commercial judgment. The words tried to build a wall. The documents had already opened the door. Amara slid one page from the folder and placed it beside the ownership certificate. Compensation schedule. The secretary reached for it only after Ellery nodded. Counsel closed his eyes for half a second, and in that brief failure of composure, the room understood there was something on that page he had hoped would remain outside the meeting record. The schedule showed proposed equity incentives, travel privileges, discretionary expense access, and a consulting retainer tied to a role that had not been approved. Sloane's face lost its shine. She whispered Julian's name, but he did not answer her, because answering would mean admitting the page was real. The CFO asked whether the compensation schedule had been reviewed by the compensation committee. The secretary checked the file. It had not. The older shareholder in Navy wool asked whether any related personal relationship had been disclosed. Counsel said the matter was private. Ellery corrected him. Not if company assets were promised. The line was clean. Sloane's hand moved toward her handbag, then stopped, because leaving too soon would confess what staying could not hide. Julian tried to speak over the next question, but Ellery did not raise his voice. He simply continued, and the authority of procedure swallowed Julian's interruption whole. The motion expanded from review to temporary suspension of any unapproved advisory arrangement connected to Sloane Avery. Her placard was removed by the secretary without ceremony. The small act clarified the room. Julian watched the white card lift from the table, and the empty space beside him suddenly looked more honest than the title it had carried. Amara did not look at Sloane. She looked at the record. Remove the access. The secretary typed, security access, executive floor access, digital file access, travel authorization, and discretionary expense privileges attached to the proposed advisory role were suspended pending review. No guard entered. No one touched Sloane. The room simply stopped recognizing her. Julian's anger sharpened into desperation, and he accused the board of dismantling operational continuity during a critical expansion window. Ellery asked whether he wished to put that objection into the minutes. Julian opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing that every sentence now became evidence. The record did not need her anger. Amara finally stood, not to confront him, but to sign the temporary restriction order placed before her by the secretary. The fountain pen Julian had used earlier lay near the center of the table, abandoned beside the failed resolution. Amara used her own pen. The nib moved once across the paper, soft and final. Julian stared at the signature, then at the woman he had mistaken for ceremonial power. "You planned this to take everything from me," he said. Amara capped her pen. "You offered it." Julian looked at Amara as if the sentence had reached backward through every signature he had dismissed, every warning he had ignored, every quiet correction he had mistaken for loyalty. Mr. Ellery moved to the final item with the measured patience of a man who knew collapse did not need to be rushed once the foundation had failed. The corporate secretary placed a new document in the center of the table, thinner than the others, but the room seemed to understand its weight before anyone read the header. Executive Authority Review and Interim Control Transfer. Julian saw the words and sat down slowly. The chair no longer made him look in charge. Counsel whispered again, this time not advice but containment, telling him to preserve his position for appeal, to avoid statements, to let the record stay narrow. Julian heard none of it. His attention had fixed on Amara's hands, still composed beside the black folder. The same hands he had once expected to applaud his speeches, sign charitable letters, and remain folded outside the room where real decisions were made. Now those hands held the voting power. The secretary read the motion aloud, her voice steady though the air around the table felt thinner. Pending review, Julian Mercer's unilateral executive authority would be suspended. Emergency signing rights would transfer to the controlling voting representative, and all major transactions would require board approval under Amara Voss's direction. Sloane turned toward Julian, waiting for the man who had promised her access to stop the room from taking it away. He did not. He could not. The older shareholder in Navy will voted first again, and the single word seemed easier this time. Approve. The bank representative followed. The CFO approved. One director hesitated, looked at Julian, then at the ownership certificate, and chose the document over the man. The minutes recorded it cleanly. Mr. Ellery counted the votes without ceremony, then announced that the motion carried. No one gasped. No one celebrated. The empire changed hands through procedure, ink, and silence. Julian's mouth tightened as if he were holding back 1,000 accusations, but every accusation required him to explain why he had not known what he had signed, why he had promised assets he did not control, why the woman he tried to diminish had understood his company better than he did. The record left him no clean answer. Amara rose only after the motion was entered into the minutes. Her movement was unhurried, precise, dignified, and the entire table seemed to shift its attention with her. Mr. Ellery handed her the interim control order and indicated the signature line. Julian's silver fountain pen still lay abandoned near the failed resolution, its polished body catching light like a relic from a former reign. Amara did not touch it. She removed her own pen, black lacquer, simple, almost severe, and signed her name once. The nib made a soft sound against the paper. Nothing louder was needed. Julian stared at the signature as though it were a door closing from the inside. Sloane's chair scraped faintly when she stood, but the secretary stopped her with a calm reminder that the meeting had entered executive session and non-authorized attendees were required to leave. Sloane looked to Julian. He looked away. The privilege he had promised her could not survive the woman he had underestimated. A security officer opened the boardroom door, not aggressively, not theatrically, simply as part of procedure. Sloane gathered her handbag with careful precision and walked out past the directors who no longer looked at her. The door closed behind her. Julian remained. Amara looked at the record, not at his humiliation. Continue. Mr. Ellery nodded, and for the first time that morning, the meeting obeyed her. The meeting continued because Amara told it to, and that was the first truth Julian could no longer purchase, soften, or delay. Mr. Ellery confirmed the transfer of interim control, the suspension of unauthorized advisory privileges, and the immediate audit of executive commitments made outside board approval. The corporate secretary entered each item into the minutes with a steady rhythm, while the directors who had once waited for Julian's nod now watched Amara's face for direction. No one raised a voice. Control moved anyway. Julian sat at the head of the table, yet the chair looked borrowed beneath him, as if authority had been recalled before he noticed. His silver fountain pen remained near the failed resolution, untouched, as if even the object understood it no longer belonged to the winning hand. The expensive coffee had gone cold, the city beyond the glass had brightened, and the mahogany table still held that faint chill beneath Amara's fingertips. Nothing in the room had changed. Everything had. Julian finally spoke, not as chairman, not as husband, but as a man realizing the building no longer answered to him. You cannot walk out of here with my authority. Amara gathered the ownership certificate, the proxy agreements, and the interim control order into her black folder with quiet precision. She looked at him then, fully, without anger, without pity, without the old patience he had mistaken for permission. The directors did not move. Mr. Ellery did not interrupt. Even counsel lowered his eyes, because some defeats required no legal translation. Amara stepped away from her chair, smoothed the front of her burgundy suit, and stood with the calm dignity of someone who had survived humiliation without becoming cruel. Julian looked smaller now, not because the money had moved, but because the room no longer repeated his version of it. He waited for a crack in her voice, one visible wound he could call weakness. None came. The secretary handed Amara the final access order, and with one signature, Julian's executive floor privileges, unilateral signing authority, discretionary spending control, and pending expansion approvals were formally placed under review. The pen moved once. The room accepted it. Amara closed the folder. Julian's expression tightened as he realized there would be no public scene to hide behind, no emotional outburst to make her look unstable, no desperate argument he could reshape into gossip. Only records, only votes, only the truth he had signed and ignored. Amara walked toward the boardroom door, and the directors rose one by one, not out of romance, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Mr. Ellery opened the door for her. Before she crossed the threshold, Julian called her name, and for a moment the room seemed to wait for the woman he thought he still knew. She did turn, slowly, proudly. Then she delivered the sentence that took back every room he had tried to close against her. "You asked the board to erase my seat, Julian. I accepted ownership of the table." No one answered it. Then Amara left. The door closed behind her with a soft, final sound, and Julian remained in the boardroom with the failed resolution, the cold coffee, the empty chair beside him, and the terrible quiet of men who had mistaken possession for power. Later, he would return to his office and find his keycard restricted, his private elevator disabled, his calls unanswered, and his name removed from the release announcing the company's next chapter. The city outside would still shine. The building would still stand. It would no longer answer to him. Down the hall, Amara entered the elevator alone, the black folder held close, her face calm beneath the soft reflection of glass and brass. She had not begged to stay. She had not screamed to be heard. She had let him create the record, sign it, and place it before witnesses. As the elevator doors closed, the empire moved forward without the man who had mistaken restraint for surrender. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.